Fantastic. You do anything nice over Shabbos? Spend time with the kids? Were they in the club?
Yeah, we had a great time. We went had lunch with respective family, the Shabbos lunch. And we had other part of my brother's family around, and so it was a family orientated. Then we went for afternoon tea at my brother-in-law's house, and that was nice. And then we came back, and then we went to the sea for the evening. So it was a family orientated weekend, and we're seeing family for lunch in Edgware, one of the restaurants, because in London you've got abundance of kosher restaurants. The problem is you've got to decide which ones to go to. It's not like in Manchester where you go to Tam or you go to JS or there's a few others. There's half a dozen plus. Yeah. Yeah. So it's nice. I mean,
things are happening. That's what counts.
I've taken a day off for work, and I want to get back tonight for work for tomorrow. So but got the phone with me, so we can connect up. Yeah, do something. Yeah.
Morning, Clive. Morning, Stephen.
Morning.
Okay, here's how we do it. We get involved. We start off obviously with what's going on in the Yiddish calendar, and it is special, especially because today's a special day already. But it's a special week. It's always a special week. And then once we know what's going on in the calendar, we move on from there to what's going on in the Parshah. And from there, we try and discuss and explore at least one point with a relevant, practical life message that can give us direction going forward for this week, for the here and now, for the current, for the time that we are living in. Torah's life. So starting what's going on in the calendar, today is the third day of Tammuz, which marks 27 years from the Rebbe's passing. And therefore, obviously, it's a special day like every other or any special yard site. But in particular, the yard site of a tzaddik, a man who made a difference to and cared about the individuals across the world. So that's obviously a very powerful special day. We might talk more about that as we go along. In addition to it being the yard site, the third of Tammuz has relevance in the Chabad calendar going back to 1927. In 1927 was when the Chabad at that time was mainly based in Russia, Lubavitch. It wasn't based in Lubavitch, but it was a big deal. But during the 20s, and certainly from going forward, Russia was already under communist rule. And it made a big, big deal for Yiddishkeit. As we know, the Iron Curtain became harder and harder. It was very, very strong at the beginning. And the previous Rebbe was incarcerated, was put into prison. It was on the third day of Tammuz where they announced his sentence. They announced his sentence that he's going to be sent away into exile. He can't come home for 3 years. He can't be seen around in his hometown. He has to report every week into the Cheka, into the police station over there. And that's why he was going to be sentenced to. At the time, it sounded devastating to the followers. Imagine, the Jewish leadership that they were following up to, and all of a sudden, the government and the authorities are sending him off into exile. Turns out, 10 days later, international pressure, including from some European countries like Germany and Latvia, some big pressure was put on to the Russian government, including from America, and he was released from the exile and was told he can come back home. But part of the exchange was that he had to leave the whole Soviet Union, which was in a way a blessing, but obviously given his line of work, it was a challenge because it meant he wouldn't be able to direct the underground, Jewish underground from the close by. But it was the cleverest thing to do. It made the most sense because he had become a central target for any time the authorities wanted to hurt the structure of Yiddishkeit. They targeted him. And although they didn't target him directly because there was international pressure to safeguard him, but anyone who was close to him, so his helpers, his emissaries, they became the next target. Anyone who was seen interacting with him immediately became the next target. So it was practical to have him leave the Soviet Union. And from outside across the border, he continued to direct. It was much harder, but he continued. But one of the things that turns out is that the third of Tammuz, which was today, seemed like a very sad day. It was a day that it was announced that he was going to be exiled and sent away from home. And then it was 10 days later that was the big deal, the 12th day of Tammuz, that he was released. It turns out that actually it was the other way around, because on the third of Tammuz, when they announced he was going to be exiled, that was in exchange for a death sentence. So really, the day he was saved was the third day of Tammuz. And then his son-in-law, the Rebbe, would often talk about it and say, like, it seems like the world, we see what's going on, we know what's happening, this is a terrible thing, this is a good thing, and we've got it all figured out. And it takes a bit of time, and all of a sudden you realize that actually, no, this was the greatest step forward, and it was the precursor to what was coming next. And often the Rebbe would forbring and say that the third day of Tammuz is perhaps even a greater excitement than the day that the Rebbe was actually released from exile. So what it teaches us is obviously that good things do happen, but more importantly, they often happen in a way that we don't even necessarily realize how good it is. And we frame it as a not good thing, but obviously in the bigger picture, and sometimes we're merit to see the bigger picture, is actually the other way around. So two big things that are happening. Obviously, it's the Riyadh of the Rebbe, which we'll talk about, and it's an anniversary of Jewish leadership began finding freedom in recent history, previous generation. So one more interesting thing for today in Tanakh. The third day of Tammuz is marked as a day where Yeshua, Moshe's successor, leads the Jewish people into Israel in the Holy Land. It was the first Aliyah. Well, not really, because Avram made it to Eretz Yisrael, so perhaps that was the first Aliyah. But the first time as a Jewish people, the people finally made it home. We became our homeland. And at that time, Yeshua was leading the people. And there were many different struggles and wars that had to be fought. And at one particular war that was so intense, Yeshua, the Jewish people were winning, but it was getting closer and closer to the end of the day. And they were worried that if it became dark, they wouldn't be able to finish the job. It would get very messy. And Yeshua davens to Hashem, and he says, Hashem, please extend daylight. Literally, like that. And Hashem answers his calling. It's written in Tanakh. Shemesh begivim doim. The sun stopped in Givon. It stopped doim. It was quiet, or it was static. And the sun stopped, and they finished the battle. And there's all sorts of commentaries that explain when that time was made up, because time is a continuum, and it's got to keep on going. But it's a tremendous miracle. If you read it, just read the literal psukim, the idea of today, when Yeshua, or on behalf of the people, needed a salvation that included changing miraculously, literally all the entire cycle of nature. And that's today, the day of Tammuz. So there's big things going on this week. But in addition to that, we also have the daily mitzvah, or the daily Rambam, which is a study which world Jewry all over learn. There are 3 general tracks that one can join to learn the daily Rambam, which is, Rambam obviously is a name unto itself, but in particular, his book that codifies every single mitzvah in the entire book, in the entire Judaism. All the mitzvahs of the Torah are recorded and explained and expounded upon in the book of the Rambam, and it's split up to learn a daily mitzvah, or a daily chapter, or a daily 3 chapters. And today is the day in which the completion of the entire cycle takes place. Every year it's just under a year, and therefore it changes a little less every year. Today happens to be the day that the 40th cycle of daily mitzvah completes, which means that tomorrow we start the new cycle. So if you weren't sure whether or not you wanted to join, let me tell you, you do. At least I can suggest that you do. You want to learn a daily mitzvah. You will get, what will you get in return? You will get an awareness and a knowledge of the entire Torah. Plus, you're doing it in conjunction with, together with, alongside, shoulder to shoulder, to thousands and thousands of fellow brethren around the world. And in addition to that, it's great to have more knowledge. It's Torah. So it's massive wisdom because it's entire Torah. It's a mitzvah because it's studying, and it's idea of harmony and shalom because it's bringing people together by way of Torah. That starts tomorrow, and we'll put up a link. You can just search on the App Store. If you're on Android, you're on iTunes, or if you're on an iPhone, look it up, Daily Mitzvah, and you'll get it straight to your phone. It is very cool to be able to learn something, especially nowadays where it's translated. Back in the day, you would have like a Sonsino translation, which is pretty basic translation, let's just say. And therefore, you'd have to really get into the head of the Rambam. But nowadays, it's normal English. It's readable, it's understandable, and it's great because you learn 1 mitzvah a day. It doesn't take forever. It's really short. And then over the course of a year, boom, you've got the whole thing. You're feeling more and more learned. And as you go along, you can do it over and over again. You get more and more familiar with it. It's a great idea, and it's strongly encouraged. So there's big things going on the calendar. Lots of good things are happening. and we're davening that everybody should feel the goodness in their own lives, in the lives of those around us. And having said that, we're going to jump into what else is going on in this week, and that's the Parshah. Parshah was written 3,500 years ago, but Parshah is ever relevant week by week. As you know, Torah is the book of Hashem. It's a dynamic book, ever relevant. And therefore, we're going to explore what's going on in the Parshah and then find a relevant point that we can apply to the here and now. So what's going on in the storyline of the Parshah? Let's just get some slides up for those of us on the computer, if it can work. The title for today, and irrational mind is great. It's also extremely limiting. Let's do some overview. The Parshah's name is Parshas Chukas. Chukas is the famous Parshah because it starts off with the red heifer. The red heifer was a red cow that was brought as an offering, but not inside the Beis Hamikdash. It was one of the only offerings that were allowed to be offered outside of the Beis Hamikdash because it wasn't really a real carbon. From when the Beis Hamikdash was built, it was forbidden to bring a carbon anywhere else. Can't just be slaughtering animals for Hashem anywhere else. To eat meat is different, but as a gift to Hashem, only in the Beis Hamikdash. And in this week, we read that there was one exception, that is the red heifer, which was brought outside of the camp. And then the body of the animal was burnt in a very particular setup. And the ashes were collected and used to purify somebody who came impure on one of the highest degrees of impurity, which is somebody who come in contact with a dead body. So if you want someone to a levaya, went to a besalam, to a cemetery, or somebody was in the same room or same house or even same building, in same room as a dead body, they also become impure. And before you could step into the Beis Hamikdash, one would have to go through a purification process, which included mikveh, but also very importantly included ashes of the red heifer, of the para aduma, and that was on a 7-day process. On the day 3 and day 7, you would have to go to the Beis Hamikdash. You couldn't go inside, and the kohen would come out and sprinkle with special water that had a drop of the ashes inside. That's this week's parsha. Going right from there, the next part of the parsha is 40 years later, or 38 years skip. So if you don't concentrate when you get to this week's parsha reading and you're not looking inside every pasuk, even if you are, you might miss. There's literally a gap. We're now in the 4th book of the Torah. We're halfway through the 4th book. There's 1.5 books left to the whole 5-book series. And we're still only 1 year in, or 1 and a bit years in, from when we left Mitzrayim. There's so much to say. So much happened. We went through the Red Sea. We had the Torah, giving of the Torah, the golden calf, smashed luchos. We had the building of the base of the Mishkan. We had all the laws of what you do bring and don't bring in the offerings. And there's loads to say. And then in this week's parasha, when you blink, or if you don't try not to blink, you jump and fast forward 40 years, and all of a sudden we're up to where they're just about a year out, or less than a year out before they're going into Israel, and Miriam, the righteous woman, who's the leader of the women at the time, Moshe's eldest sister, passes away in her old age, ripe old age, 126 years old, if I'm not mistaken. She was an old woman, but she was an extreme great tzaddikas. And when she passes away, they're then in the Midbar Tzin, and it's still in the desert. And all of a sudden, the water well, which magically came around with them wherever they went, dries up. And then obviously we know the reason why it dries up is because it was all there in the merit of Miriam. And when she passed away, the water well dries up as well. And of course, the people are like really worked up. What are we going to do without water? How can it be? And Moshe davens to Hashem, and Hashem tells him, go and take your staff and talk to the rock. And tell the rock to give water again. And Moshe Rabbeinu famously goes to talk to the rock. And as we know, the story goes that he speaks to the rock, and he's speaking to the wrong one. And the rock doesn't respond. And then he remembers, hold on 1 second, 40 years ago, when we started this rock off, Hashem told me to hit the rock. Maybe I'm not supposed to be talking to the rock. Maybe I'm supposed to do what I did last time. Hit the rock. Moshe picks up a stick and strikes the stone. This time, the stone he strikes is the right stone. And water starts to trickle, and then hits it again, and water comes forward, and water is supplied to the people again. But, and of course, you know the story that Moshe Rabbeinu had made a mistake here. Moshe Rabbeinu hit the rock instead of talking to the rock. And Hashem's like, first time round, in the beginning, I told you to hit the rock because the people need to see that sometimes you just got to take orders. I'll tell you what to do, and this is what you do. The Jewish people have upgraded by now. Now they need to see that we talk to people, we talk to things, we give instruction by word of mouth, and that's good enough to be able to listen to. You should have spoken to the rock, and that would have been a demonstration to the people that they have to now step up. You're no longer a kid and just told what to do. Now you've got to take it in. You got to use your intelligence, your brain, and understand good things and follow orders because you understand them. So talk to the rock rather than hit it. But you didn't. And that created the lessening of Hashem's greatness. And therefore, in exchange for that, you will not be able to go into the Holy Land of Israel. Both you, Moshe, and Aaron will remain outside in the midbar, in the desert. And Moshe Rabbeinu davens and asks Hashem, please, whenever it's mentioned that I don't go into Israel, please make it clear that my mistake was hitting the rock. Not that I didn't want to go into Israel, like the spy story that we had 2 weeks ago. Not like anyone else who was sinned and therefore didn't go into Israel. It should be recorded that the sum total of the mistake was hitting the rock, not anything else sort of rebellious. How are we doing? Any questions, comments, suggestions, please? We're going to keep going along the summary of the Parshah.
But it's interesting, Rabbi. I thought it's when he broke the tablets first time round. I thought that was a time when he wasn't allowed. Hashem decided that he couldn't go into Canaan.
Great point. Actually, the answer is no. The answer is that when he smashed the tablets, Hashem was appreciated for what he did, and he was never punished for smashing the tablets. The other way around, he was rewarded almost. He was commended for smashing the tablets, and that's because. Hold on a second, we're doing the wrong thing here. That's because smashing the tablets actually saved the people. But there were other stories that Moshe Rabbeinu was borderline whether he was and wasn't. He wasn't doing what he was supposed to do. There was the story about when we had it a few weeks ago when Moshe Rabbeinu complained to Hashem and he said, Hashem, how can I handle these people on my own? Can we really look after all their needs? And Hashem says, you know what? I'll bring you helpers and bring the 70 elders. That was a borderline exchange because Hashem, he asked Hashem, can we really supply all their needs? Could we ever satisfy them? But this is one of the big ones. When Moshe Rabbeinu in front of everybody's standing around watching, and he talks to the rock, and then instead of trying to talk to the right one, he hits the rock, and Hashem takes him to task. Obviously, he's being held to a very high standard. But Hashem is the one who's in charge and decides that Moshe and Aaron are not going to go in, at least not at that stage. Asher, how are you? Good morning.
Good morning, good luck. Baruch Hashem. Good to hear you. Good.
Thank you for joining. We're going to jump right along. We're moving into the next step. After Miriam passes away, and we had the story of the drying up well being brought back to working order, we also have that Aaron pass away a little later. And he passes away on Har HaHar, the Mount of Har. Now, Har means a mountain, so it's the mountain of mountain. And apparently this is a double mountain. It's a mountain with a peak. And then you can go deeper, higher still at the mountain, and that's the higher, the peak upon the peak. And that's where Aaron goes up. Fascinating how the Torah describes Aaron's passing, where he literally was told step by step, lay down on the bed. He took off his curtain clothing. He watched the sun put it on, and he passes away. Moshe calls it a kiss of death from Hashem. And he says that Moshe says to Hashem, I wish I could, at my time, have the same thing. And later on, Hashem tells Moshe, he will also pass away the same way. But here, Elazar becomes the new high priest, Kohen Gadol, and Aaron passes away. Unfortunately, the Jewish people were not behaving again, and snakes come out and start biting the people. And the story goes that the Moshe Rabbeinu was asked quickly down in Hashem, there are serpents here killing the people, what can we do? And Hashem tells him to build a monument that will be the shape of a snake, and it will be on the top of a pillar. And every time someone was bitten, they will look upwards. And when they look upwards, they'll remind themselves that the snakes are just messengers, just tools from Hashem. And Moshe Rabbeinu famously builds quickly a high pole, hangs a brass serpent on it. And why did he use brass? Because Nachoshes which means brass, is the same word as nachash, which means the serpent. And therefore he makes a brass serpent and hangs it up, and it literally works. People remind themselves that Hashem is in charge. They pray to Hashem, and every single one of them, the daven to Hashem, is healed. Famously, this becomes the symbol today of medicine, where you have a serpent wrapped around a staff, which is a symbol of medicine, coming from the sixth Parshah. And of course, the end of the Parshah has two more stories. One is the story of the miracle of the well, which they sing the song for, and the end of the Parshah is the first battle for Israel. I remember reading that Arik Sharon was once asked, how come he used to be a left winger? How come he all of a sudden became so strong right wing? So he said that I've never changed my opinion. Back in the day, they used to say 2 sides to Jordan, both are ours. That's what the right wingers would say. And the left wingers would say, no, 1 side of Jordan is ours. He says, I've stayed in my position. I've always kept. We're not talking about what he did in the end with Gush Katif, with the whole Gaza, but the idea that 2 sides to Jordan, both are ours, is actually from the Torah. It's a quote that we don't often say today, but back in the day, just go back 50, 60, 70 years ago, it was a common quote. Why? Because the Torah says that the area on the on the east bank of the River Jordan is also part of the inheritance of Eretz Yisrael. And actually, the first place in Israel that was conquered, that became Jewish, was that the east bank. And that's in this week's Sedra. There was Sichon and Og, who were on the east bank of the River Jordan. And that area was considered the safety buffer, where they had 2 mighty kings. One was called Sichon and one was called Og. And they were known to be ferocious. They were giants. They were big. They were powerful. And they were going to safeguard that if anyone tries to attack the 31 kingdoms in what we call Israel today, it was then called Canaan, they would fend them off. And it was in this week's Parshah that Moshe Rabbeinu himself leads the battle, leads the Jewish people, and he's still around, and he conquers those 2 areas. And those 2 areas, which are on the east side of Jordan River, are become the first place where the Yiddish people settle, and they're already inside what's going to become Eretz Yisrael. It's not mainland Israel, but it's still in Eretz Yisrael. And that's the end of this week's Parshah of that section of the land that's conquered by Moshe. Of course, under the strict instruction of Hashem. That's this week's Parshah in a nutshell. So, big stuff in the Parshah, 40-year gap, Miriam's passing, Aaron's passing, and the first bit of conquering of Eretz Yisrael, big stuff. But today we're going to focus on the first very opening of the Parshah, which was a year and a half into the Jewish people's sojourn in the desert. And the opening of this week's Parashah talks about the mitzvah of the Para Aduma, the red cow, the red heifer. And we're going to focus on that just because in this week's Parashah, the wording used to describe that mitzvah is unique. It's very special wording. And it tells us, it somehow plays up the mitzvah as if it's like one of the most fantastic mitzvahs. The mitzvah of the Torah is this week's Parashah's red cow. And of course, we're going to discuss what's so special about this mitzvah that makes it the one mitzvah that's called Zois Chukas HaTorah. This is the law of the Torah. The law. Really, there are 613 laws. How did this one become the law? Especially since the law doesn't really help us today because we don't have not a red cow and not a Beis HaMikdash to go into. And for the past 2,000 years, we haven't had either. So what is the uniqueness or the message in this mitzvah that is so special that the Torah terms it as the law? And we're going to try, hopefully, to decipher and bring out of that. Before we do that, we're going to focus on this mitzvah, the red cow, for a second and ask which part of the mitzvah makes sense. And we're going to actually learn that the mitzvah of the red cow, almost nothing of it makes sense. It's one of those mitzvahs that is so hard to rationalize. It's so hard to explain what it does, how it works, or why it should work, or why it's needed. But this is the mitzvah. It's called the chukah, a mitzvah that doesn't make sense. And here is the question before we start. The question for today's class is, what is the correct balance in Judaism with logical understanding versus blind faith? Should we be driven mainly? How much of what we do should be faith-based? How much of what we do should be driven regardless of how it could be explained, understood, or rationalized? So some of our faith literally has to have an element of just faith. That's what we call it faith. But a lot of what we do, a lot of our non-Jewish friends do also. How much of what we do, where should we draw the balanced line of what we're doing when we're measuring, when we're deciding? How much of it should be faith-based and how much should be logical understanding, rational, use your human mind, intelligence, the brain that we have? So is the way to measure? If anyone has suggestions or comments, please. Clive, I just read your note. Wow. When's the birthday? It must be around now.
No,
next
I
week.
couldn't understand the question. Sorry.
1 second. That's a question.
That's a question.
Words.
1 second. I'll ask the question. I just want to say, Clive, the birthday's next week.
21st. Yeah, a week on Monday. My birthday. Yeah.
We need to make a party.
Yes,
Yeah.
indeed.
It's a big day. You just guys have birthdays. Actually, I was just saying, Clive wrote that it's his bar mitzvah sedra. So I was saying, I think if it's his bar mitzvah sedra, then probably his birthday's around now. So he's saying, yeah, we've got a birthday party coming up. You're all invited. I just invited you.
True story. A true story.
Hold on, Asher. Let's hear a story. Go ahead, Clive.
A very quick true story.
Please.
Izzy Simons, who was the beagle, I think they called in a shul. The man, you know what a beagle in a shul is. It's the calling up, the shamus, the running round, everything. He taught me Balak, the whole Sedra, the whole Haftorah, and then Reverend Brish told my parents it was the wrong week.
No way!
So I had to learn the whole lot again.
Which one of them do you remember? Both?
I don't really remember Balak because I've done Chukas a few times since, so I can practice it in a couple of weeks, 2 weeks it takes me.
Amazing. Asher, the question is, when you're deciding what's right and wrong, are your decisions based on faith only, or are you supposed to be using your brain, your head? Should we be
because it's got reaction, isn't it? It's got reaction.
Gut reaction, is that good?
It depends on the situation, doesn't it? Really.
Depends
on the situation.
Absolutely.
And I think my answer. Sorry, somebody else is talking.
Asher, no, go ahead. You were listening to you, Asher. Asher, say, please.
I was thinking that we use the mind, to know that we have Hashem. So that is to believe that Hashem is there. So, and the belief. So I think it's, in a way, you're using your brain, but you also know, you believe so strong to be able to make to know that Hashem is there and what we need to do, the orders that He gave us.
Let's ask the question in a different way. Thank you, Asher. Let's ask the question: how much space does Yiddishkeit leave for human intelligence? Go on now.
One could argue the more you learn, the less you know.
Ooh, deep. Okay.
So in the end, it's a faith scenario. It doesn't matter how clever you are, how logical you are, and how much you know. There's always more. And obviously, the more you think, the you can outthink yourself and go in any direction. So ultimately, it comes down to faith.
Wow.
The learning is lifelong. It's always been known that in the secular world, it's lifelong learning. That's what we call it. You learn something new every day anyhow. It doesn't matter what age you are.
Oh, very good. Very good. You should always be learning. We should always be learning. And is learning faith or is learning in logic?
It's both, I think, personally. I think it depends on where.
Jewish answers here today. Very Jewish answers.
Yeah, it depends where you are. Depends if you're in the work environment. Sometimes it's you have to sort of work within your environment you're working in. If it's a home, you could possibly use the more Jewish ideas.
Right. So we're going to say when it comes to decisions, certainly when it comes to Torah decisions, the answer we're going to reach at the end of the day, I'm going to tell it now, but just in case we don't get time to say it at the end, the answer is going to be that it is faith-based. But because we have faith, therefore we must use as much logic as we can. So because the foundation is so strong, we need to use faith. So we need to use our minds, our brains, to try and figure it out as much as possible. The difference is only going to be that we're not trying to figure out whether or not it's right. We're trying to figure out not whether or not we want to do it, how much we can get our head around, how much we can connect. That's what we're going to focus on, and we'll hopefully build it up into more tangible words. But we are going to come to the conclusion that the faith is the foundation.
I think that faith enables us to question, to use logic, because even if we come against arguments, we are faithful enough to always, the bottom line is that this is God's will, or that we have to compromise, we have to accept the arguments. And if you have that faith, you can argue till you're blue in the face and you still love each other.
You sound like you've been to yeshiva. I love it.
Yeah.
Great. Well, let's go down the track and let's see how it comes from the Parshah. But also let's put it into a workable tool that we can take with us throughout life. Whenever something comes up like this along those lines. This is the game, at least this is the objective of today. Starting off with the pasuk that describes the mitzvah of the red heifer. I'm going to ask you to follow along on the screen if you have it. Hashem speaks to Moshe and Aaron saying, this is the law of the Torah that God commanded, saying, speak to the children of Israel and have them take for you a perfectly red, unblemished cow, upon which no yoke was laid, it was never put to work. You should give it to Elazar the Kohen, because he's now the new Kohen. And Elazar the Kohen was the secondary Kohen at this time. He's not yet the Kohen Gadol. He's the helper Kohen. And he should take it outside the camp and store it in his presence. Elazar the Kohen should take from its blood with his finger and sprinkle it towards the front of the tent of meeting 7 times. So he's outside the camp and he's facing and sprinkling towards the camp, the tent of meeting, the home of Hashem, and he does that 7 times. The cow is then shall be burnt in his presence. So it's the meat of the cow and the bones of the cow, the remains, its hide, its flesh, its blood, with its dung, he shall burn it. And everything is included in that bonfire. The Kohen shall take a piece of cedar wood, hyssop, and crimson wool, and cast them into the burning of the cow. And that was part of the ingredients that had to be there in order to make it kosher. And then once they did that, they collected the ashes, and they would use those ashes, stored very carefully, obviously, because it was extremely precious. Throughout history, we have a total count of 9 Parah Adumas that were done successfully. Okay, so you're talking about 3,000 years, and we're up to 9 of these things. So that's a lot to hold on to. The truth is, 2,000 don't count. So between 1,000, 1,300 years, they only had 9, which is still a lot. Still a lot of years, a minimal amount. But those ashes were used very, very scarcely, very carefully. It was mainly a cup of water that came from a special fresh water well, and then they would sprinkle a little bit of ashes onto it each time it was needed. But this is the part of the Parsha that needs explaining, because we know generally the mitzvahs are divided into 3 categories. The Themishpatim, which are rules that we could figure out on our own. Don't kill, don't steal, honor your parents, things that make sense, they're logical, we get it. Mishpatim. Edus are the kind of rules that make sense, but you wouldn't have found them in a secular court of law. For example, ritual laws. Keep Pesach. It makes sense that we keep Pesach. It commemorates a big day for us. But you're not going to find that in English law and British law, because it's an edus. It's a testimony to something Jewish, but it makes sense. Shabbos even. The fact that we have to keep Shabbos because it commemorates Hashem's creation, that's an edus. It's not something you would have come up on your own. Don't work on the 7th day. But now that we have it, we get our head around it. It's understandable. And then, of course, the 3rd category, which is the one which is called chukim, and those are the ones that are statutes that don't make sense. Just so the Abba should decide. Hashem decided you have to have tzitzis, but your tzitzis have to be made in a particular way. Usually the tzitzis we can get. But what's about the tzitzis, the reason why it's on the picture is because it's probably talking about shatnez. There are certain clothing that you can wear, no restrictions, except for wool and linen sewn into or woven into the same single piece of clothing. That garment becomes forbidden to wear. It's like milk and meat. You can have milk, you can have meat. You can't have milk and meat together. Why not? It's Hashem decided. And there are many other mitzvahs that don't actually make sense. One of them being all the laws of purity. fascinatingly, person goes into the mikveh to become pure, you got to dip into the water entirely. The entire body has to be under the water. So you'd imagine, why are you going into water? Because you're dirty and you got to get clean. Here's the facts. Fun fact. Before going into the mikveh, a person has to be the cleanest they will ever be. You cannot have the slightest bit of dirt on your body when you go into the mikveh. It's just, otherwise it's considered a blockage and it doesn't let the water of the mikveh contact, and therefore it's not considered properly. So before you go into the mikveh, you're cleaner than you're ever going to be. And the mikveh water, here's another fun fact, doesn't have to be clean. It should be. You better hope it is. But it doesn't have to be. It's kosher mikveh, even if it's not clean. So clearly mikveh is not about cleansing. In the literal sense, what is mikveh about? And the answer is it's a ritual. It's a spiritual cleansing. Spiritual cleansing, what does it mean? You got to go into it's not a spiritual pool of water. It's a materialistic, it's a physical pool of water, but somehow it accomplishes spiritual cleansing. So the whole idea, the whole concept of purity and impurity is certainly cleansing of purity doesn't really make sense. It's not a rational thing. And then it goes a little further. When it comes to ashes of a parah aduma, it's not just doesn't make sense. How did ashes make things clean? It's ashes of a cow. Which part of that makes sense? It doesn't. That's the truth. That's how Hashem decided. So much so that Rashi brings down in the opening of the Parshah, Hashem tells us that this is a chukah, is a non-rational mitzvah, so that we shouldn't even try worry if someone says, what's this all about? We know from the outset. We know from the get-go, this is one of those things that we do even though it doesn't make sense. This is the way it is. But then this particular mitzvah, the mitzvah of the red heifer, is called the chukah of all the chukas. It makes so little sense because here is one twister, one extra spinball at the end of this non-making sense mitzvah that makes it make even less sense than any other mitzvah that doesn't make sense. And that is the mitzvah parah aduma. First of all, it's purity and ashes rather than water, ashes together with different water. But here's the catch. Anyone who's involved in helping to prepare and administer this purification process, so whether it's the person who's carrying the ashes of the red heifer, whether it's the kohen who literally just took it and sprinkled it, anyone involved in that process becomes impure, needs to go to the mikveh after getting involved. The only person who becomes pure is the recipient of all the service, the fellow who'd been to the Pesalem, to the cemetery, to the funeral, and needs to become purified. So he becomes pure. He was impure, became pure, and the fellow who was pure, he was the kohen who was helping out his mate, he was helping out his friend, he now from purity became impure. So whatever you are, it changes your position. And that's the least understood part of it. Is this a purification agent? Is this a tool that makes people pure? It doesn't, because it makes the pure people impure and the impure people pure. And that's what doesn't make sense extremely about this mitzvah. And this is the mitzvah that is called the chukah, the least understood mitzvah. But what's going to drive
it's called the chukah?
Dot chukah Torah.
Ah.
This is the chukah of the Torah. Now, it's commonly known as the chuk of all chukim. The statute, the irrational or super rational, not like irrational. Irrational sounds like it doesn't make sense. Super rational is beyond making sense in a way that's beyond any other mitzvah. Okay? So it's the least understood. Now we're going to ask ourselves, why in text 1 did we have the verse says, this is the law of the Torah. The law of the Torah. This is like the least inclusive law. It's the last law you're going to think ever to consider the one law that sums up everything. It's so illogical that even Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, the wisest man of all times, he says about this mitzvah, says the Midrash, and quoting in the name of Shlomo and Solomon said, I understood them all, but the passage of the red heifer I analyzed, questioned, and investigated, couldn't get it. The Solomon states in Koheles and Ecclesiastes, I said that I will become wise. Amarti achakma, I said I would become wise. But it was far from me. What was far from me? Says King Shlomo, there's one mitzvah I cannot begin to understand. Everything else I understood. So there are mitzvahs that don't make sense. General purity, impurity, milk and meat, shatnez, wool and linen, all those mitzvahs that we don't necessarily understand. Solomon, the wisest man of all times, understood it. But the one mitzvah he couldn't get was the mitzvah of paraduma. It's so not common. It's so out of the box. It so doesn't make sense to us. The Shlomo HaMelech, the wisest man of all times, couldn't understand it. In case you're wondering how we know Shlomo HaMelech was the wisest man of all times, it says so in the Pesukim and Malachim. And God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding, exceeding much in largeness of the heart, and the sand that's on the seashore. And Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the children of the East, and the wisdom of all of Egypt. He was wiser than all men, than Eitan, the Israelite, Haman, Chalkol, Darda, and the sons of Balchol, and his fame was in all the nations around about. Shlomo HaMelech was the wise, very, very wise man. He couldn't get it. So clearly, this mitzvah doesn't make sense even to Shlomo HaMelech. So here's the question number one. How do we call this one mitzvah the mitzvah of the whole Torah? What's the general message from this mitzvah that the Torah says this is the one mitzvah, the mitzvah of the Torah? Question number one. Question number two is Moshe Rabbeinu somehow does manage to get the answer. This is another fascinating fact. Yosef son of Rav Chanina said, Hashem says to Moshe, to you, L'cha, ani megala tam para, avlachar chukah. To you, I will reveal the reason of the red heifer, but for everyone else, it remain a chukah. So if there's a reason, how come Shlomo HaMelech couldn't get it? If Moshe could get it, how come Solomon couldn't get it? Is there a reason or is there not a reason? So could it make sense on some level or not? That's going to be question number two. So we have here two questions. Question number one, why is this minority mitzvah considered the law of the Torah? And question number two, why was Moshe gifted the ability to understand it and not why Solomon? In order to answer these two questions, or more importantly, in order to turn these two questions into a relevant message, we're going to ask a general question. Do mitzvahs that don't make sense have a reason that's hidden, or they don't make sense because there is no reason? So the mitzvahs that we don't understand, there's actually a medieval debate between the greatest thinkers of the Jewish people. Let's take the mitzvah of not having wool and linen spun into the same garment. So you go to Marks and Spencer's or you go to wherever you go, you get yourself a beautiful suit. It's great. You bring it into the shatnez testing and they have a look at it and they say, actually, the shoulder pads are sewn in with linen. And therefore your woolen suit that's got linen stitches to sew in. Nowadays, it doesn't really happen that much, but it could. Linen was cheap. It's sewn in with linen threads, which makes the entire suit, or at least the jacket, forbidden to wear until we take out those threads. So the shatnez testing center takes out the linen threads, replaces it with synthetic, with whatever, and they bring you back the suit. And you say, oh, thank you very much. It costs you £15, £7 for the checking, £7 for taking out, and you got a kosher suit. It'll have a little hechsher in it that your suit's been checked. Mitzvah done. Had you not had it checked and someone suddenly found out that it's got the shatnez, you would have to take it off right then and there. There's always the conversation, what happens if you find out all of a sudden that the trousers you're wearing have shatnez in it? What do you do? Yeah, it's a sad story. But let's just say that it was a jacket. So before you put on the jacket, it was forbidden.
But what does it do?
Sorry?
Rabbi, what does the actual, when you wear it and it's not allowed,
yes.
What does it do something to you? Does it metameh? Does it?
It's not metameh. It's just it's forbidden. It's forbidden to do. Just like it's forbidden to take something that doesn't belong to me. And whilst I've done that, it's a crime. It's a crime. Actually, it's a crime in the common sense as well. But it's breaking the halacha. Wearing a jacket that has a linen stitch in a woolen jacket, wearing it the whole time that I'm wearing it, it's a crime. I'm doing something I shouldn't do. I have to take it off right away. So I'm asking you, where's the sense? Is there a hidden reason somewhere that I just don't understand it? Or no, it doesn't make sense on any level. Does there have to be a reason for Hashem to give us a mitzvah?
I will give an answer there and say it's both. Under normal circumstances, I would suggest there is no reason. It is a test of faith. However,
yes,
I also suggest that in the time of the Mashiach, the understanding of these chukim will become known, and maybe even a red heifer will appear.
Wow, okay. So we've got one suggestion here
Amen.
that today we don't understand, but there is a hidden reason that we don't understand yet, but we will get to understand when Mashiach comes. Great angle. Anyone want to agree with that? Anyone?
I agree, yeah.
We've got no two agreement. Anyone not agree? Let's just say whichever side you get on this, whatever side of the coin you take, you have great backing. Do mitzvahs, all mitzvahs have a reason somewhere? Just it's so beyond human comprehension, we can never get it, but there's a reason, or not.
But the mitzvahs are in various categories. There's certain mitzvahs like keeping Shabbos and keeping various laws, but there's other mitzvahs. For example, you mentioned before about going the extra mile, about learning. Now, it's not something which is, it's a mitzvah, but it's not something which is you've got to do it. It's a command. It's you got. I mean, it's an extra. If you want to give tzedakah, if you want to help somebody across the road, you want to befriend somebody who is lonely, whatever. These are mitzvahs, and supporting the community in a lot of ways. But there's certain things, the Shabbos, keeping kashrut, etc., etc. So we're in different categories, aren't we? And
does every mitzvah have a reason, though? Is there a logic to every mitzvah? Is there a reason somewhere, even for the ones that make sense?
Absolutely, it has to be. Yes,
it has to be. Okay. Yes. Says the Rambam. I agree with you. The Rambam says yes, every mitzvah has a reason. There are some mitzvahs that are so beyond human comprehension, our minds don't have that bit of software installed. Let's just say, or our processors aren't capable of handling such advanced technology, but we know what, we don't know why. There's a why in a higher realm, on a deeper understanding. We're just not there yet. But those who reach the higher understanding when Mashiach comes, or Moshe Rabbeinu, they get the reasons for everything. We're just human, mortal minds. Ultimately, he says the Rambam here in the second paragraph, every mitzvah has a reason. Even obligations or prohibitions serve a purpose. Every obligation. The purpose of some has been explained to us, such as the prohibition against murder or theft. The purpose of others has not been explained to us, such as the prohibition against eating trees' fruit for the first 3 years, or the prohibition against planting forbidden mixtures. Whenever we find such a commandment, when the reason is not understood, it's due to lack of our own understanding. Okay, that's helpful. Rambam's position. He goes further and he says, actually, having that premise teaches us that whenever we come across a mitzvah that doesn't make sense, we should try as best as we can to make sense of it. Because there must be a reason. Let's try and dig it up. That's the Rambam's position. The Kuzari, who's also a great scholar, he writes similar. He says everything's got a reason, but ideally we shouldn't need to search for a reason. We should have so much faith that we don't need the reason. If we're in a position that we don't feel the faith, then yes, like the Rambam says, go explore. However, for one who has fallen from this lofty level and begun philosophizing, it is better to seek a reason for these things which are rooted in the divine wisdom than to resort to the misconception or doubts of the ultimate destroy a person. Okay, so that's Kuzari's position. So far, this is the camp, the side that say every mitzvah has a reason. During the similar time frame, or later still, there was a lot of other opinions that said, actually, no way. Every mitzvah needs a reason. What do you want about? What does reason mean? What does logic mean? Logic means human intelligence. Who created humanity? Who created logic? Logic is a creation of God. The fact that some things make sense and some things don't make sense is how God programmed us. God is beyond all that programming. He made it. He doesn't have to fit into it. Does God literally have to have a rationale for everything that he does? No. Hashem can be these reasons that have been concocted in explaining explanation of the Chukim, as though the divine commandments today were like some kind of self-help book or fantasy, says the Maharal of Prague. Oh yeah, it's the other side of the coin. It's inappropriate to assume that God's commandments were given on human terms. Rather, they are decrees of God, who issues decrees into his nation, like a king who issues decrees over his kingdom. He doesn't need to excuse himself. He doesn't need to explain himself. He's beyond reason. Beyond reason means there's no reason, says the Maharal of Prague. So we have two sides. We have on one side that the human mind, this is the debate. Do Chukim have a rationale? It's only beyond mortal comprehension. It's much beyond this, but there's certainly rationale. Or as the Maharal says, no, it's entirely above reason. It's not limited by reason in any shape or form. So now, before we go further, is it better as human beings to understand what we're doing? Or is it better to do something, just do it because it's the right thing to do? Which one is more advantageous? Understanding what we're doing and why we're doing it, or doing whatever it's right, regardless of whether it makes sense or not?
Rabbi, there's a parallel. If we go into the academic side of it, there is actually people who study rationale and to be able to work out the rights and wrongs in a very generic way. It's nothing to do with about doing Judaism or politics or everything else. They actually can do courses and people study it, and there's mathematical equations that prove certain things that you can do and not do. It's a very accurate. I've seen it. I can't do it. It's a very high level stuff. I think one of the guys who comes on, the English chap comes on, he's from Russia, I think he is. He'll understand what I'm talking about. Is we do things in binary, ones and zeros, stuff like that. These are very academic things. In Judaism, we can't really put the rationale behind it. There's no chance. Absolutely not a chance, because some of the things we do have no real rational status and real reasons why we do it. It can't be actually proved right or wrong. It's just that we have to do imuna. It's faith, and that's how we have to take it. Very, very difficult to look at it unless we look at the mathematics behind it all. And if we put the maths into it, it could frighten some of the great Rabbanim. It really would, because some of the things would not be able to be acceptable, if that makes any sense.
I want to tell you, they won't be frightened, but absolutely, yes, it's very different when we see things from that perspective. But here's the idea: when a person uses the brain, there is tremendous advantage, and Yiddishkeit is going to teach us there's a big advantage. First of all, when we use our brain, then we're connecting to the idea. Number two is that we're not going to make mistakes if we make and just assume that, maybe there's a minhag to do something. I'm not sure if I understood it correctly. Well, use your brain. Go find out. So when we study and we learn things and things make sense, we're on track to get it right. But at the same time, we're also on track to make mistakes in a different way, such as when we start believing that we know and we understand, and then we limit ourselves by that understanding, what we often make jump to conclusions and assume that we've figured it out, even if we haven't or before we have, and that could be a mistake. When it comes to Yiddishkeit, that would be like somebody trying to say, oh, I understand this mitzvah. It's to do with, and then I fill in the blank based on my mind. Where did that fill-in come from? It came from the rationale that I already have, my past experiences, my past knowledge, my past awareness, which is great, but it's not necessarily correct. And what tends to happen is I try and fit Torah into my mold, into my understanding of things. That's not healthy, because then I've not been objective. Using braininess, intelligence all the time, leads to the risk of letting that intelligence cheat, in the sense as making as if I'm being intelligent, when actually I'm not being intelligently honest because I'm not really being objective. That's one risk of limiting our understanding to understanding. Number two is that not everything fits into an equation. Some things don't actually fit into the black and white binary. For example, you might have a parent who has a very particular way of running the household, but some of the kids need exceptions to the rules. It's just this type of education or this type of rigidity or this type of laid backness doesn't work for one of the children or one particular time in the child's life. They need something else. Not everything fits into an equation and a system. When it comes to the Shulchan Aruch, this is the Rabbanim know. There are 4 sections to the Shulchan Aruch, and famously in Yiddish they say the finif techelik. The rabbi needs to have common sense or intuition. Let's not use the word common sense because common sense isn't so common. It's not so common. But let's just say intuition, yeah? The rabbi needs to understand how to apply a halacha. And that sort of application isn't an equation. So it's not all about rationale. It's about rationale plus something else. But more importantly, when a person studies and works hard, then you manage to achieve more things. You do. There's a tremendous advantage of using your brain. And this guy's going to teach us that we should use our brain, but some things need more than a brain. And that is when it comes to relationships. Think about it. This is the Flintstone example. Here. The true reason for mitzvahs were not revealed, for they transcend intellect and understanding. Even those mitzvahs for which there seems to be understandable reasons, these reasons are not the ultimate reason. Rather, there is a much deeper wisdom contained within, one that is above our ability to understand. Classic example is the perfect couple, right? So don't think of us, it's a dangerous example. It's a dangerous example. But let's just say he wants to make sure his wife is happy. So he gets her the things that she wants. Why did he get that particular flavor or that particular color? Does that make the slightest bit of rational sense to get this particular color and not that color? Or go on vacation to one park and not to a different park? And of course, the answer is it makes sense to go to a particular place, do a particular thing, not because it makes sense to do that, but because the relationship is more important than logic. How many times do we end up doing something that doesn't make sense to us on any level, but because it does make sense and it's important to a significant other, so that relationship overrides and supersedes our rationale and logic. We sometimes even do things that we would never do otherwise. We would refrain from doing, we consider it harmful. But compare that to the investment that we're putting into a relationship. Not only is it okay, that's the choice we're making. Not based on logic, but based on something deeper than logic, the relationship. And we're going to learn that mitzvahs are exactly that. Mitzvahs, although they have reasons, those reasons aren't the reason we do it. So why did I buy my wife a gift? Oh, because it makes sense to buy something nice. No. Not because it makes sense. Because the relationship is much more important than whatever I understand and can explain. It's much deeper than that. It's at the core of it. Because a relationship that's built only of what makes sense, it's very dangerous waters. What happens the moment it doesn't make sense? What happens the moment it stops making sense? Is that out the window then? That's not a very reliable relationship. It's not a very strong relationship. A relationship has to be much deeper. If my child doesn't give me nachas and doesn't go in the way that I hoped and dreamed for, do I no longer love my child? Chas v'shalom. So hopefully our relationships are built on something much deeper than sense, much deeper than logic. When it comes to Hashem, it's the same thing. And this is the fascinating angle. Even the mitzvahs that do make sense, that do have a rationale. We understand why you should be giving tzedakah. We understand why you shouldn't steal. We understand why you should be honoring your parents. We know that. It makes sense. Says the Torah, no. It makes sense, but don't limit it to the sense that it makes. Do it again. Don't limit it to the sense that it does make. Says this week's Parshah, this is the law of the Torah. The law of the Torah that makes zero sense is how we approach every mitzvah in the book. We try and understand everything, but we know that it's much deeper than the biggest and best understanding we can get at it, because it's the relationship that it's driving. It's the relationship underneath it, that it's fueling and feeding, that's really important. So the fact that I can explain why I go to shul, the fact that I can explain why I don't try and keep Shabbos or put on tefillin, those explanations are great, but the feelings behind it, the connection that it represents is much deeper and much stronger than any explanation. Says this week's Parsha, don't do the non-explainable mitzvahs like you do explainable mitzvahs. Don't just keep the mitzvahs that don't make sense, even though they don't make sense. The other way around. Keep the mitzvahs that make sense, even though they make sense. Follow the mitzvahs that are easy to understand, even though they're understandable, follow them. What does follow them mean? Allow them to help us be close to Hashem. It's hard, because as human beings, we are encouraged to use our mind. Walk into a yeshiva any day. What are they discussing? What are they screaming and shouting over? What are they? Rationale. They're trying to understand things. We need to use our mind because that's how we connect with things. But we need to remind ourselves, and that's the message of this week's parashah, that even whilst we're trying to understand as much as we can, use the gift called human intelligence to be able to be better people. We shouldn't forget, though, we shouldn't let this distract us and remind ourselves that what we do isn't only because it makes sense. Even the mitzvahs that make sense, don't do them because they make sense.
This is surely why, for most of us, calling ourselves Jewish per se and keeping the traditions of Judaism, and perhaps, I mean, I can't put myself in the position of somebody who is far stricter than I am, but perhaps also for the people who are less strict, we can relate to this argument of today's shir even more, because for us the traditions and being proud Jews is perhaps is the predominant aspect of our Jewish life.
Amazing.
And tradition is not a logical thing, is it? It's not an argumentative thing, or rationale thing.
Yeah. Very much so. Well said. Shkoyach life. That's what we're saying. And that what we're trying to do is borrow that idea and bring that into the next time we come across a mitzvah that maybe we didn't do until now. The reason why we're doing it isn't because it's going to make sense. We're going to try and make sense of it. But it's much deeper than that as well. Chukas HaTorah, the law of the Torah, is the law that is a connection, a relationship mitzvah. Every time I approach a mitzvah, don't think of it as rationale. Think of it as a closeness, an intimate bond with Hashem. That's why we do a mitzvah. And of course, if we can understand it, it's even better. I just want to put this on the screen, Chabad.org daily mitzvah, and it's on the app stores as well if you want to get it, download it. Tomorrow is when they launch a new course. The first 2-3 days are warm-ups, and then by the end of the week, we'll be on track for a mitzvah a day. It is fascinating to be able to go along. It's very easy. You can get it to your email if you want. You can get it to your WhatsApp. You can get it on the App Store if you like, whenever you have time. Strongly encouraged. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. I know I'm going over time, but I thank you for coming, and I'm wishing you all a wonderful week. If anyone has any more comments, questions, or suggestions, please stay on. Anyone has to go, thank you for joining.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Have a wonderful week.
Thank you. Thanks,
Take
Rabbi.
care. Thank you.
Rabbi.
Before we go, I need to give you a ring sometime this week. You need to have a chat. But I'll ring you
Sure.
later.
I'm always there, always. Anytime.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Take care. All the best.
If I don't answer, please leave me a message. I'll call you back.
All right. Thanks.
Birchas koine mit dabei nemmer shlem mit dabei han mal lem because varchas meis mal lehem yivrach echad ney vishmecha yer adin pon melach vichoneka yisad ney pon melach yisem khashal mesam shmi abnei yisov ani avarchem. Have a blessed week. Chazak ubaruch.
Shavua tov.
Shavua tov Hashem. Don't forget to do something mishnayot. Do something special today. Yom Elula shel Rabbi. Ayom.
Wow.
Malay brachot.
I was wondering, I wanted to ask you before because I saw it on the thing that you've sent, but I didn't know when did it start? Last night or tonight?
Last night, you can still do a candle if you have, and you can, I have one here. You have a candle?
Yeah.
Very good. So maybe I'll maybe if you have time, you can write a letter on oilchabad.org.
Yeah.
Put it online. Put your name and your mother's name and brachot for everything. It's a special day.
So, yeah, but sorry, I missed you. What did you say? Did these Yotzeit started when?
Last night.
Last night. Okay. Seder Gamor.
בהצלחה, בשורות טובות להשם.
זכות הרבי, משיח צדקנו יבוא, ויגלה.
אמן. גאולה פרטי וגאולה כללי.
זה, כן, זה הבעל שם טוב אומר.
נכון, 100%. אוקיי, הצלחה השם.
כל טוב. You're welcome to come and bring me a candle if you want. Skala mitzvot, but it'll be nice to see you. It's a good excuse.
Pardon? It's a good excuse. I'm running, but I'm going to come run past your house.
Okay. No. Don't delay
I'll come back for a second.
I've got